Good morning, everyone. I see everyone has taken their seats. Welcome to the Humanities Symposium, What is Real? And thank you all for coming. I feel we are super lucky to be here today, both in the sense to be here at Vanier on the unceded territory and ancestral lands of the Kanagahaga people, which I think we should recognize to inspire us to make efforts to seek a more just relationship with Indigenous peoples, and something I think Vanier is undertaken seriously as we see so many new initiatives to teach students, faculty, staff more about our Indigenous communities. This is also a traditional meeting place for many Indigenous tribes, including the Anishinaabe and others. So I guess today I sort of see it like as an offshoot of that tradition, as we are here to meet our guest, our keynote speaker coming all the way from Ireland, making quite a big effort, flew in last night, thank you, David Robert Grimes. I'm absolutely thrilled that David has agreed to come here today, and I'm going to tell you why. I first heard of David Robert Grimes in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. He was being interviewed on PBS NewsHour about the COVID-19 conspiracy theories, and I saw his book flash across the screen, The Irrational Ape, and the subtitle, Why Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk and How Critical Thinking Can Save the World. So I was so excited, I said to my husband, Jean-Marie, who's here, I said, Jean-Marie, I need a pen, find me a pen, I need a pen. And so Jean-Marie just like paused the screen, because technology, and he's like, we'll get you a pen. So I got a pen, and I wrote down the title, and I ordered the book. Since then, I read the book. Since then, I've been incorporating it in my classes. It is so good, and it touches upon topics I think everyone can benefit from learning. The American title, maybe David will talk about that later, is called Good Thinking. They changed the title, and that is on sale here after the symposium for you. And I will happily admit that I am, pleased to be promoting his book, because I think it's really worth reading. I think it's something that everyone can benefit from, how to guard yourself against your own psychological biases and some of the problems in our modern world. So, I am excited, like I said, that he came, but not because David is a cancer researcher, not because he's written about science and public understanding for some of the top tier publications that you guys might know, like New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, BBC, The Irish Times. I'm not excited because he's taught at Oxford, I believe. And I'm not excited because he's won various awards. I am excited because he's so clear about how our psychological biases and our media landscape are working against us knowing reality. And that makes us very susceptible to being duped. This is something we need to be alert to and on guard against. You need to be alert to and on guard against, because there are bad actors out there, and not knowing what's real can lead to bad decisions. So I've been presenting his ideas in my class, and I am happy today to present him to you. So get your pens out. Get your pens out. Get your pens out. It's time to take notes. I don't want you to miss one thing from David's talk. And while you're getting your pens out, I'm going to ask you also to kindly put your cell phones away. We know these are distracting devices, and I want you to be able to focus on what I think is going to be an absolutely wonderful talk. This is Paranoia for the People: The Rise of Conspiracy Theory, Disinformation, and Propaganda in the 21st Century. David Robert Grimes.
So can everyone hear me okay if I stand here? So I can't wait to live down to your expectations, because I've been sold far too high. I am Irish, as you can probably tell. we tend to speak way too fast. So I'm going to look around the room, and if you look a little bit confused, I'm going to assume it's because I'm speaking too fast. But please do indicate if I am. I get very excited, and I get ahead of myself. So I think when we talk about critical thinking, I like to start with extreme cases because they make the point very nicely. You all look really, really young and haven't been tainted by the cynicism of the world just yet. I'm very envious. But I want to tell you about a story that happened way, way before even my time. So this happened, some of you may have heard of a thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And to give you a very brief history lesson, there was a lot of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And back in 1962, the Soviet Union had stationed nuclear warheads on Cuba, which was an ally of it. And America was not happy about this, and there was a lot of tension. And everyone thought the world might end for about 3 days. And then Khrushchev and Kennedy, these two guys here, they came out and they sorted it out. And it was considered a gold feather in Kennedy's career. But what people didn't know is that at the exact same time, something way more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis was happening in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. There was a submarine there called the B-59, and it had dived too deep to communicate with Moscow. It was a Soviet submarine. It was being pursued by an American destroyer, the USS Randolph. And the Americans, to try and make the Soviets rise and identify themselves, were dropping depth charges. Now, if you're inside a submarine and someone drops a depth charge, it's apparently like being in a steel drum and someone hitting it with a sledgehammer. It's very unpleasant. It was 52 degrees Celsius inside the submarine. They were running out of oxygen. They were full of carbon dioxide, and they were running out of water. They were down to 1 glass a day when it was 52 degrees. So as you can imagine, not a situation conducive to making good decisions. What the Americans didn't know is that the Soviets had a nuclear warhead on that submarine. So, bit of an oops, right? And as they were pursuing it, the Soviets could no longer communicate with Moscow. What the Americans also didn't know is that if the political officer and the commander of a ship agreed that they didn't need to contact Moscow to launch the nuclear warhead, they were allowed to assume that a war had begun and fire it. If they had done that, we would have a very different history of the world. Now, I know history isn't always the most exciting thing, but the world didn't end in 1962-63. So what happened? Well, this very handsome gentleman also happened to be on that submarine. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. He was a submarine commander, and he was flotilla commander, so he had equal rank to the political officer. The political officer and the commander decided they were going to launch the nuke and take out the Randolph. They knew they'd die themselves, but they assumed, well, war's begun already, so we might as well do this. The reason they didn't fire it is that this man basically put his foot down and said, if we fire that warhead, we have started a war. We don't know whether a war is really happening. We're getting ahead of ourselves. I demand that we resurface and communicate with Moscow and find out what's happening. Now, we should be very grateful for that. It's been called sometimes not only the most dangerous moment of a Cold War, the most dangerous moment in human history. And another thing, Thomas Blanton, the director of National Security Archive, said, a guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. Now, I wish that was a one-off story that was just a bit of madness in the Cold War. Then it happened again in 1983. At this time, the Soviets had this command center called OKO, which basically was their radar detection system. And this was the gentleman in charge of running it. The same guy, by the way, he's just separated by a few years here. And suddenly his job was, if any nuclear warheads came in, was to tell the Soviets that, hey, there's some missiles on the way, so they could launch their own barrage of missiles back and practically end the world. In September 1983, all the alarms went off. And his 5 missiles were inbound. His job was to ring the Soviet air defense and say, hey, you better launch an airstrike, we're getting hit here. That didn't happen. He picked up the phone and he made a very different phone call. He rang the technical guys and said, your detector's faulty. Now, why did he do that? He did that because while everyone else was panicking, he thought about it rationally. He went, all right, if the Americans were going to attack us, they'd have to attack us with all-out force. 5 missiles we could shoot down. They're not stupid, they're not going to do that. He then, before he rang the technical guys, he asked them to get a ground radar reading, just to check if his system was working. And they couldn't find any shadow missiles. So he, in the end, decided, right, it's more likely this is faulty. He was absolutely right. It turns out the detector had spotted 5 low clouds and decided that it would almost end the world over that. Do you know how he was rewarded for all this, discovering this? He was demoted because they said, well, you should have rang. It was your job to ring. You didn't ring, so therefore we're punishing you. They punished him for not ending the world. And it wasn't until about 2017, the year he died in, that people suddenly got to know his name, Stanislav Petrov. So 2 Russian people who saved the world, right, with applying critical thinking. I want to show you what happens with the opposite thing. Does anyone know who this gentleman up in the far corner is? Yeah. Chairman Mao. Yeah, absolutely. And in the late 1950s, there'd been a long, hard-fought war in China, and Mao's Communist Party had essentially won. And they were trying to modernize their society at a rapid rate in a similar way that the Soviets had. And they had a campaign called the Four Pests Campaign. As part of their drive towards modernity, they were going to get rid of rats, because rats vector disease, flies, because flies can vector disease, mosquitoes, because mosquitoes can vector disease, and also, in this rogues gallery, they added a strange element. Does anyone know what that bird is? That is the humble Eurasian tree sparrow. Sparrows aren't exactly considered vectors of disease, so what was the deal? Well, to Mao and some of his colleagues, these were birds that were eating the farmer's grain without doing any work. They were animals of the bourgeoisie. That was how they were described. And they had a thing called the Great Sparrow Campaign to eradicate them. And this is a nice wood carving of it. In now Beijing, was Peking at the time, they got a force of 3 million students to go around there smashing up eggs, shooting the birds if they could, but mainly they would bang pots and pans. So the birds would be too scared to land and would eventually die from exhaustion. Outside the Polish mission in Peking at the time, it was ankle deep in dead sparrows. Right? So it was a pretty shocking thing, but it was very effective, because within a year, they had killed all of them in China practically. Over 1 billion sparrows were dead. There was one problem, though. There was an ornithologist in China who was maybe telling this wasn't the best idea. Does anyone know what sparrows mainly eat? Insects. And do you know what their favorite insect is? Locusts. Without any sparrows in China, locust populations absolutely exploded by 1958. They suddenly realized that the ornithologist they'd put in prison for saying this was actually correct, but it was a bit too late. They went to the Soviet Union and had to start importing sparrows. It was still far too late, and between that and other disasters in what was called the Great Leap Forward, it led to the Great Chinese Famine, which killed between 15 and 45 million people. And this is a consequence of when critical thought becomes afterthought. So these are very extreme examples, and you're probably never going to have to worry about stopping a nuclear attack or making international policy for a brand new country, but there's lessons here for all of us. Now, the really shocking thing, which probably won't shock you that much because you probably all have TikTok and things like that, is that the vast majority of information we are now exposed to online is simply untrue, or it's tainted in some way. There was a great study, this is back in 2018, and there's been a lot of follow-up since, that false news, or as Donald Trump would say, fake news, it travels much further and much faster than reliable information. And we're going to look a bit at why that is in the talk, and that we are far more easily vulnerable to it than we might actually think. During the pandemic, you might remember this term. I wonder if I have a pointer on this. I don't. Whoops, I went too far. The infodemic. The WHO described the abundance of information around coronavirus, some of which was accurate, some of which was horribly inaccurate, as an infodemic, and kind of like a shadow plague that followed it. And it was interesting because COVID was the first pandemic of a truly digital era. And we saw the amount of misinformation that perpetuated. You were all very young through it, but I'm sure you were exposed to it as well. And it's a mixture of the words information and epidemic, so it's a portmanteau of that. There was legions of examples. Back in America, and I don't want to pick on your nearest neighbors, but it's fun to pick on them, so let's do it. Ivermectin became a big thing. Ivermectin is a deworming agent mainly given to horses. It's for parasites. There was a whole explosion of beliefs about this, that ivermectin could cure COVID-19, so you didn't need the vaccine, you could just take horse deworming medication. It got so bad that the FDA were telling people, you're not horses, please stop taking these medications. They didn't work. There was other ones, hydroxychloroquine, that was the one that Trump went and told people that they should all take. He also said to inject light into their veins. I'm not sure if you remember that press conference. That was I was asked to comment on that by BBC, and I didn't have a comment. It was too weird. And if you remember at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a belief that 5G was causing COVID-19. Now that is biologically impossible, but it led to over 187 arson attacks around the world. This one here is a burning 5G car. I think that might be in Canada, actually, that one there. But it happened in Ireland, it happened in London, it happened in Manchester. My favorite thing is we didn't actually have a 5G network in Ireland, so what they set on fire, ambulance cell phone tower, and they were very proud of that. And I was like, well, if you don't know what you're setting on fire, maybe you shouldn't be setting on things on fire. But however, I need to point out these are often considered pandemic problems, but they existed far, far, far before that, right? In the year 2000, the US was declared measles free. They didn't have a single case of measles. It was considered extinct. If you look at what happened over subsequent years, measles cases exploded back up. And the main reason that happened was that anti-vaccine conspiracy theories took root online and off and drove parents away from vaccinating their children. And because measles is so virulent, the average measles case leads to 18 extra measles cases. So it's pretty virulent disease. You now see rates of deaths where you didn't see it before. And it's now been declared endemic again to the United States. But this was happening in different junctures as well. I wrote this paper a good few years ago. I'm going to move that slightly so I don't have to contort myself too much. And this is, again, based on US data. So again, we can pick on the US, it's fun. But remember, it maps pretty closely to Europe and it maps very closely to here. About 12% of the American population believe water fluoridation is a conspiracy to dump chemical waste in the water. It's not. We might get back to that later. 12% of the US believe that the CIA deliberately infected people with AIDS. There's a really interesting history of where that came from. If we have time, we'll jump into it. It's not true, but where it came from is interesting. And this is before, obviously this paper came out before there was a coronavirus vaccine, so it was early on. But I love the fact that 37% of the population believe that the FDA is suppressing a cure for cancer. That's, if I translate the numbers, that's 110-ish million people in the United States who believe that the FDA have a cure for cancer and they're just hiding it. We're going to talk about why that's probably not a great idea. And it comes into our politics as well. I mean, I'm talking about health science because that's my area, but it's politics as well. Disinformation has splintered things to a huge degree. And there used to be a stereotype about conspiracy theories that it was just people with tinfoil hats that lived in their mother's basement. It's actually not. It's about a quarter of the population are highly susceptible to conspiracy theories. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. We've seen it last year and the year before with Ukraine. You had people pushing disinformation. And more recently, it's happening with the Gaza-Israel situation. We will get into a little bit of that. So in political issues, disinformation is very, very common. And I'm going to break that down in a little while. Canada also has its own. Every country has its own form. You had your Freedom Convoy, much of which pivoted on conspiracy theories. And about a quarter of Canadians also believe in conspiracy theories. So it's about the same as the rest of the world. We're all unique by being the exact same in that regard, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about that causes. This causes a thing that's sometimes called cyber balkanization. Back in 1996, when the internet was still quite young for people, they were told that the internet's going to unite us, it's going to bring us all together, we're going to have new perspectives, and everything's going to be fabulous, and we'll have flying cars by 2015. Yay. There was a bunch of researchers in MIT who said, you know what the internet might do? It might make us find people that share our opinions in little tribes, join those tribes, and never listen to anyone else. And they were kind of called pessimists and called silly, and they called their model cyber balkanization, the idea that we'd fracture into states that resembled the fractured states of the Balkans, and they were considered pessimists. Unfortunately, time has proven they were probably correct about how we consume information. We are much more likely to consume information that is palatable to us, that we like, that agrees with our prejudices, and everyone is. And that creates these interesting bubbles that we're going to break down in a little while. And what that really causes is polarization. You end up back in chambers of people with your opinions, or on the opposite side, different opinions, and people become more and more resolute, not listening to anything else, and they polarize out, they separate out. We've seen that through politics over the years. Again, using US data, because there's so much of it. We have 1994, the median Democrat and the median Republic, well, they mainly overlap. They're very similar. They differ on things. By 2004, it's separated a bit more. 2014, these are like two separate mountains. They're no longer overlying peaks. And if we did this again this year, it would be even further apart. And that is the same everywhere. It's happening here. It's happening in Europe as well. You're getting increased polarization. And this is some of the consequences of information. We saw it in Brexit, by the way. There's analysis of hashtags that are at Brexit. People that were tweeting for Brexit or tweeting for Remain they didn't interact with each other. They were in separate little bubbles, sometimes called filter bubbles. A few definitions I'm going to use before we get into the nitty-gritty. I'm going to use misinformation kind of as an umbrella term, but what misinformation generally refers to is the inadvertent propagation of false claims. If I turned around and said to you, sugar makes children hyperactive, you might nod and agree. It's actually false. It doesn't. But I wouldn't intentionally be trying to mislead you. If we say that in conversation, and people that say those kind of things aren't trying to mislead you. It's wrong, but it's not intentional. Disinformation is the deliberate propagation of false claims. Stuff you know is wrong, or someone knows is wrong, but still pushes anyway because they have an agenda. We'll talk about that a bit. And the third weird cousin here is malinformation. That is when you give correct information, but out of context to mislead. I'm going to show you an example of that in a while, because that's the weirdest one. You've probably heard misinformation, disinformation, right? But has anyone heard malinformation before? You're welcome. New term you can use. All right, I'll give you an example of malinformation. Has anyone ever heard of dihydrogen monoxide? I'll give you, some of you have and some of you haven't. This is found, it kills about 250,000 people a year. It's found inside tumors, inside acid rain, inside nuclear waste. It's so corrosive, it can destroy metals, it can erode landscapes, and it's really difficult to get out of our food chain. You can't wash it off, you can't get rid of it. It can also poison people quite badly, and it's very, very common in foodstuffs. In 2014, people in New Zealand were asked whether they wanted to maybe ban this or restrict it in the food supply. Based on what I've told you, is that something that maybe we should look at restricting? I get a show of hands. Who thinks that sounds a bit dangerous? Maybe we should. Some of you are really suspicious of me. I like that. Who thinks, nah, leave it, it's fine? Okay, yeah, so most of you, who doesn't have an opinion? Okay, we'll play a game. What does di mean? Two, okay. And what does hydrogen mean? Well, hydrogen. What does mon mean? So what's dihydrogen monoxide? It's water. It's H2O. You are far brighter than the New Zealand legislators who did vote to ban water. This is malinformation. Everything I've told you about water is correct. It can kill people. It does rust metal. But what I have left out is the incredibly important context. So I've presented information out of context to make you scared of something. That's malinformation. So that's a more common name. Context is crucial. I'm going to speak a little bit about why we go wrong now. Now that we know there's bad things and we have a few definitions, let's talk about the psychological and practical reasons why. And sometimes it's about logic. Did anyone watch Game of Thrones? I'm not sure if you're all, if anyone too young or too old to watch. You did. So that was considered quite a bloody medieval fantasy. But let me tell you, the medieval church made that look like Enid Blyton, right? It made it look like a kid's book. There was popes killing popes, plotting revenges, raiding villages. It was all a wild time in the year 800. And in the year 832, there was a very famous trial where one pope, Pope Stephen VI, or 7th, depending on how you count your anti-popes, because it was a hell of a time for anti-popes, was putting his predecessor, Formosus, on trial. So the previous pope was on trial by the current pope, and he was accusing him of nepotism and simony and all that kind of fun stuff. And he didn't respond. He said, look, how do you plead? And Formosus refused to reply. So Stephen turned to the jury of learned cardinals, and he said, an innocent man would defend himself. The former pope has done no such thing. We must find him guilty. And they found him guilty. They chopped off 3 of the fingers on his right hand so he couldn't perform blessings. And then they threw him into the Tiber, which is a raging river outside Rome. In Formosus's defense, he had been dead for 8 months before the trial began. People don't tend to be overly talkative 8 months post-mortem. My favorite fact of this, by the way, is Formosus is Latin for handsome. I don't imagine he was particularly good-looking 8 months after death. Now, Stephen wasn't an idiot. This was a politically motivated trial. But the illusion of logic was enough to give him a pretense. And it turns out that psychologically, if something seems logical, even if the logic is very ropey, that we can then convince ourselves that that's a solid decision. By the way, it didn't end well for Stephen. By the end of that summer, he had been strangled by a few of his closest friends, and one of them became Pope. So, now when you see Pope Francis, people looking very zen, think it was a very different thing back in the 800s. And you get this a lot. Skewed logic comes up. For example, I looked at this a few years ago in a scientific paper. The moon landings are a perpetual focus for conspiracy theorists, right? There's people say, oh, men never landed on the moon. Well, they did. They left mirrors up there. If you have a powerful enough laser, you can shine them off and get the beams back and all sorts of fun things. But one of the things I always point out to people when they ask me this is that the Apollo program required over 400,000 staff and contractors just to get it to go. And it took almost a decade to do. And there's ample evidence of this, and yet about 6 to 20% of Americans and about a quarter of Britons don't believe it's a hoax. So why doesn't the evidence dislodge that? Like, there's overwhelming evidence this happened. And this is what you always get. This is a false logic premise. If there's a cover-up, the official reports will undermine our conspiracy theory. The reports undermine or debunk our claims, therefore that's proof there's a cover-up. This is bad logic. There's a rake of reasons this is faulty logic. But the illusion of logic is what a lot of conspiracy theorists pivot on to try and prove this case. So, you know, it's the famous, oh, well, you would say that. They would tell you that. That's what they want you to believe argument. When you present evidence, if people say, well, that's, you know, this should be inconsistent, and yet it is not. By the way, I looked at this years ago in a paper, and it turns out that even if all those 400,000 people really wanted to keep a secret, if you break through the maths of it, it would be really hard to do. And there's a reason why back in the 1500s, Machiavelli was telling people, never, don't commit conspiracies, they're a waste of time, you'll get found out. And Benjamin Franklin, 2 centuries later, said 3 men can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Turns out keeping secrets is really hard for a long time because people blab, right? Remember Watergate, the famous, well, you can't remember Watergate, none of you were born for Watergate, not even I was born for that. When Richard Nixon's presidency fell apart, that's because the most powerful man in the world couldn't get 12 men to properly rob a hotel. So when you hear about these massive conspiracies of hundreds of thousands of people, be a little bit skeptical. But a lot of this is rhetoric. We're very, very influenced by rhetoric, and everything we consume on social media is a form of oratory or rhetoric. If you go on TikTok, people aren't usually giving you a nice nuanced opinion. They're giving you something with a slant on it, and we are very susceptible to that. I'll give you an example from my work. I do a lot of working in the cancer space, and occasionally when I'm working with patients, I have people come out and go, I'm going to give up my chemo because I heard that I could take cannabis for this. And I kind of nod and I listen. And this is an interesting thing. So these are, by the way, this is not true. Cannabis will do nothing for cancer. Please do not think that I'm endorsing this. But these are just some images I went and did a Google search and found this. I love, my very favorite meta one is the very first one that says, cannabis cures cancer, Google it, which I found on Google, which has sent me to an infinite loop of just Googling this back and back again. It didn't, I'm still here. But you see things like this, cannabis oil destroys cancer cells, all this kind of stuff. But there's sometimes underneath a conspiracy theorist or a bad idea, there's a grain of truth that's been horribly, horribly misunderstood. So I'm going to tell you that THC, the psychoactive component that gets people high in cannabis, actually does kill cancer cells in a petri dish. So does water. So does salt. So does bleach. So does accidentally putting the incubator half a degree too high or half a degree too low. So does sneezing on them. It turns out it's really easy to kill cancer cells in a petri dish. What you really want to ask, the question that's important, is can I kill cancer cells in a person without killing their cells? And to that, cannabis is useless. Absolutely useless. But that is a grain of truth that's been in a form of oratory and rhetoric made to mislead you. The fact it said there that cancer oil destroys cancer cells is true, but so does everything else. And this is where, again, I mean, XKCD, which is a online comic I love, says, when you see a claim that common drug or vitamin kills cancer cells in a petri dish, keep in mind, so does a handgun. I would say, so does hot water, but that's not going to cure many diseases because they're more complicated. And the reason I get frustrated with this is because it actually harms patients. It's not harmless. So this is a paper from 2018, Skylar Johnson's team over in Utah. He was in Yale at the time, he's in Utah now. And they looked at patients who used complementary and alternative medicines when they were diagnosed with cancer, and those that did not. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen a graph like this. This is a Kaplan-Meier survival curve thing, and this is how in cancer science we work out how drugs or different performances go. Patients that took complementary medicine had about twice the hazard ratio of dying per unit time as people that did not. And the reason that happened is that if they were very into alternative medicine, they tended to delay their conventional treatment or refuse it until it was too late to be effective, in which case that will seriously affect your odds of survival. The classic example of that is Steve Jobs, the Apple founder, used to wear turtlenecks, a bit before your time. He had a curable pancreatic cancer, which is rare enough in itself. He had a rare form of pancreatic cancer that was fully curable. Instead of taking his conventional dictated medical advice, he decided he'd go on an all-juicing, all-green diet because he heard that would cure cancer. By the time he realized that that was not curing his cancer, The cancer had advanced too much for even conventional medicine to save his life, and the then richest man in the world died because he didn't listen to his doctors. He listened to stuff like this. So there's consequences. But I'm speaking in some ways as an expert. I was just saying to people that no longer really cuts it, because rhetoric has kind of polluted that to some way. If we go online now, you can find a so-called expert saying anything you want, right? I've just told you there about, cannabis doesn't cure cancer. You can find an expert that will tell you it will. You can find any fringe figure who'll tell you anything. I wrote about for Scientific American, and it was during the pandemic that we had a rake of fringe scientists. We had scientists coming out there saying COVID is not real, or they were telling us that it could be cured by ivermectin. They were fringe figures. So I always point out that the mere fact that someone has a scientific or a medical qualification does not a priori mean that they are telling you the truth. And that's because science pivots on the totality of evidence. It's not just the opinion of one person, it's what does all the evidence say. But because we love rhetoric and we love relying on expert opinion, it's really easy for us to find a good video online of a guy that says he's got this all figured out. I'm thinking of someone like Andrew Huberman, does anyone follow him, the scientist? He's a scientist in Stanford. He says a lot of things that are absolutely false, but he says them very confidently. And that's why he has an audience of tens of millions of people. That is something to be aware of, right? It arguably never was a good way of gauging whether something is valid or not. Does anyone know who this guy is here? I'd be very surprised if anyone does. He's the only person in history to win 2 Nobel Prizes on his own. His name is Linus Pauling. And have you ever been told if you had a cold or felt a bit sick that you should take vitamin C? Has anyone ever said that to you? Yeah? Yeah, they've all said it to me too, right? It's his fault. It doesn't work. It does nothing for colds, right? But this guy, 2 Nobel Prizes, and in the early 1970s, he became obsessed with the idea that vitamin C could not only cure colds, he thought it could cure cancer, snake bite. Later on, he said it could cure AIDS. He was wrong, but he was a guy with 2 Nobel Prizes. And because he kept writing books about this, people kept buying it. And even though it was debunked, even back in the 70s, we knew this didn't work. That we also know that unnecessary vitamin supplementation does nothing for you. It's persisted in our cultural knowledge so much that people still say it. And we still kind of believe it's true. We'll come back to why we do that in them. But he was an expert. He was just wrong about something. And this is where expertise and arguments from authority, as they're called, can be very, very slippy. You need to always be assessing the evidence. If an expert is not giving you the evidence accurately, their qualification doesn't matter anymore. They are, as ignorant as anyone else. And we can use expertise as a proxy for the most part of evidence-based, but not always. What are the psychological factors that make us really prone to this kind of stuff, whether it's conspiracy theories or disinformation? Well, there's cognitive drivers, which is to do with our thought processes. This is from a great paper about 2 years ago on this. People who are very keen intuitive thinkers, who rely on their gut feelings an awful lot, they are more prone to fall victim to this stuff because analytical thought does slow you down a little bit and make you ask questions. Cognitive failures, if you don't check your sources, you don't work out if the information is accurate first, or you don't look at counter evidence, that makes you more susceptible. And the other thing, and we kind of touched on this already, but I'm going to make it explicit now, is illusory truth. And this is terrifying. We'll come back to this. Illusory truth is the terrifying psychological reality that if we are consistently exposed to a falsehood over and over, we start implicitly accepting it as true, even if we know it is false. That is kind of mind-blowing. But I feel it myself. I mean, I always point out I will still tell my niece when she's hyperactive, she's had too much sugar. I know sugar doesn't cause hyperactivity, but I have to stop myself and then go, oh, that's not true. I am very much a victim of illusory truth on that one because I've heard it so much, and we all are to some extent. The other side are socio-affective drivers, and this actually affects younger people more, but it affects everyone to some degree. Source cues. Is the person from an elite? Are they from an in-group? Are they attractive? Are they someone who you look up to and they're saying something or selling something? Does that make it more attractive? And emotive stuff. If it makes you scared, angry, or jealous, any strong emotion, that is a very powerful modifier of how much we accept information. And also if they form a partisanship, a worldview that you agree with. There's also a thing with social media called parasocial relationships. So we look at influencers and celebrities, they form a fake relationship with us. And we can get very invested in that. How many people are very invested in whatever Taylor Swift is doing right now? She doesn't care what you're doing, right? That's a parasocial relationship that we start projecting fantasy onto people in different in-groups. And we all do it. It's the celebrities and musicians we admire. But we then feel that that's in concert with us. It usually isn't, although their marketing team might want you to believe it is. The illusory truth thing I've mentioned already, but dictators have known this for years. It's so shocking. Psychologists have only discovered it in the last 20 years. But Napoleon once said, there's only one figure in rhetoric of serious importance, namely repetition. He should have said repetition, repetition, repetition. His whole point was, if you keep repeating it, it works. Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow said, a reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. Authoritarian institutes and marketers have always known this. So while psychologists have discovered it like yesterday, people that have been manipulating you have known this for decades, right? And you see it in politics as well. I'm picking on Americans again, but listen, it's fun. Let's have some fun. The amount of Americans that believe the vote was stolen, that is obviously not true, but it's repeated so often that people might start to think it is. And of course, Trump and his supporters know that. The other thing that's related to this is called the availability heuristic. And that's our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easier for us to remember, or more recent, or have more emotional weight. This guy here, he reads that 12 have died in an airplane crash, and he says, I'll never fly again, because he's read something scary about airplanes. He hasn't said, oh, well, I'll compare that to road travel, where you'd find out it's a lot less safe. And that is, I go back to the definitions again. We don't really need them. We've already seen them. By the way, anti-vaccine propaganda, which is one of my areas of research, is not a new thing, and it relies entirely on availability heuristic and illusory truth. This thing here is from 1845. It's a very old thing. That one's from 1905. You'll notice that the anti-vaccine mythos that we hear even now, they haven't really changed. Vaccines are poison. Vaccination is causing problems. There's been an anti-vaccine movement for 300 odd years. Right? As early as we had the first vaccines, we had an anti-vaccine movement, and they haven't changed their information. They've changed how they target it. They've been very good at manipulating social media. They were very good at getting on the early internet as well. And the way they rely on it is they rely on scary stories. They will tell you, oh, my friend took the vaccine and then they died. And in your mind, that is the availability heuristic has been triggered then. You remember that scary story and you afford it more weight when you hear it again. What you don't remember is how many millions of lives the vaccines have saved. COVID-19 vaccines in 2022 saved an estimated 19 million lives worldwide. But those people didn't die, so they're not a scary story. If you take one scary story, even if it's not true, it tends to have more emotional weight than that dry statistic of how many millions of lives saved. Even the measles vaccine, which is common as mug, saves about 1 million lives a year. And when we don't have it, people die. So that's interesting. And again, when I said the socio-affective drivers, celebrity status means a huge amount. And I mean, that also goes for YouTube streamers and everything else. Anyone that people aspire or admire have a huge amount of influence on how we make decisions. For example, if Oprah Winfrey recommended a book, it became a bestseller. When she backed Barack Obama in the 2008 presidential election, she got him about 1 million extra votes, is what most of the analysis says. So celebrities do actually influence us. The Kardashians aren't just rich because they keep getting into scandals. They're very good at influencing buying and selling behavior. And maybe that's a question we need to ask ourselves. Do we want to be manipulated that way? And figures, by the way, I've kind of picked on their very female-centric things. I need to point out this goes across the brand. Joe Rogan is the most popular podcast in the world. I don't think Joe Rogan's ever had a guest on who wasn't trying to sell something. Russell Brand in the UK and Alex Jones. Remember Alex Jones? Pretty before your time. Big conspiracy theorist. I won't get into all of his stuff. He was making about $65 million a year selling supplements to people off his show. Rogan sells supplements. Brand sells supplements. Because the supplements do nothing, but you'll buy them because you admire the celebrity who's selling them. Or you trust them. But why? I'm just making sure we're okay on time. We're okay on time? All right. But why are we so susceptible to this? There's a thing called motivated reasoning, and I want to tell you about a UFO cult in the 1950s, right? So this is a guy called Leon Festinger, and he said, a man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures, he questions your sources. Appeal to logic, and he fails to see your point. And this goes back to something he was studying in the 1950s. There was a UFO cult in Chicago who believed the world was going to end on the 21st of December 1954, right? And Leon Festinger was trying to understand why people held beliefs that didn't match evidence. He wanted to understand that. So what he did in the days where ethics were much more flexible is he just sent his PhD students to go and live with this cult. You'd need so much paperwork for that now. But he said, go live with a cult. It'll be fine. No biggie, right? And they did. And they recorded everything. So on the 21st of December 1950, the world did not end. Big spoiler there, right? It's still here. We're still here, and it's 2024. Bloody hell. 70-odd years later. What happened was, as they believed that UFOs were going to come and beam them up, and the whole world's going to be destroyed in a cataclysmic event, right? And as they waited, nearer and nearer midnight, nothing arrived. No spaceships came to beam them up. And they all went into despair initially. And then what happened was the cult leader disappeared off for about an hour and came back with a magical message he suddenly received, that their sheer faith had saved the entire world. And from that day forth, they had to become evangelists for this faith. So instead of actually losing their belief in it, they became more committed believers. If you ever heard of the Seekers, and who eventually became the Seventh-day Adventists, that's where they stemmed from, right? It wasn't the first time it happened either. The Millerites had the great disappointment in the 1800s where Jesus didn't come a second time, but they're still one of the biggest churches in the world. So it's funny that people get more into it. And the reason we do that is that it's often very hard to admit we were wrong, to change a belief. We have an emotional affectation for a belief, and it is easier to bend evidence to fit that belief than to change that belief, right? Motivated reasoning underpins a lot of things, by the way. In climate change, for example, the biggest single predictor of whether someone rejects the reality of anthropogenic, man-made climate change is whether they are a free market libertarian, as if they believe the economy is going to fix everything in the free market. And there's a reason for that. If you are a free market libertarian, free trade and deregulated industry is a pretty central tenet of your identity and your belief. If someone comes along and says to you, the only thing you're really against is trespassing, property rights are big to you. Now, if someone comes along and that's your philosophy and you've committed and that's what you identify as, and someone comes along to you and says, there's a bit of a problem here. You know, when you burn that carbon over there, you're actually destroying my property. You have two options. You can go back and go, I need to refine the boundaries of my philosophy and my identity. And people can do that, and it's hard work, and it's the intellectually good way to do it. Or you can just deny there's a problem. You can just say it's all a big hoax and shut up and you're lying. And that's what people tend to do because that's easier, right? That is much easier than going, wow, I might have to change my mind. It's much easier to deny there's a problem. You see it with climate change a great deal. Now, obviously, fossil fuel companies push this a lot as well. But the biggest predictor of whether you reject climate change is being a man. But men tend to be libertarians more than women, so we think it's a comorbid factor. This used to be a huge thing years ago because companies like fossil fuel companies know that you can manipulate public doubt and perceptions, right? Cigarette companies knew from at least the 1930s that their product was killing people, that it was carcinogenic. But it wasn't commonly accepted till the 1970s by the industries themselves. And back in the 60s, they had this memo that was leaked called Doubt is Our Product. And they basically insisted that if we can keep the public convinced that, you know, the jury is out on whether cigarettes cause cancer or not, that we can keep selling our products unimpeded. And that's exactly what they did. They set up fake Institute of Tobacco Studies. They put out crappy papers to try and cancel out the science. And what the public were left with was a perception that the science was unsettled. Actually, the science was really clear. We'd known from much earlier, even in the 30s, that cigarette smoking is causing cancer. And yet it took 40 years before they had to do anything about it. More than 40 years, right? The exact same playbook is played with the fossil fuels. Fossil fuel companies pump a small fortune and have since the 1960s into, causing confusion over climate change, trying to amplify voices that say it's not really happening, because otherwise they'd have to change their behaviors and also would be liable for the massive damage they've done. So we're manipulated by that. I'm going to start getting towards wrapping up, I think, just to keep you going. But what's the real thing that I've talked here about disinformation, how we get confused by things. What about conspiratorial ideation, right? Conspiracies really happen. If I decide I'm going to pick on you in the front row and say we're going to rob a bank tomorrow, right? And we decide we're going to do it, that's a conspiracy, right? But when we talk about conspiracy theories, that's not really what we're talking about. We're not interested in those little criminal conspiracies. We have these big narratives, big overarching narratives where people are doing things. Conspiratorial ideation is a human cognitive flaw where we have a tendency, or some people have a tendency, to ascribe to conspiracy what would be better ascribed to random events. There's people that see conspiracies in everything, in other words. Conspiratorial ideation is a hell of a drug because you can turn anything into a conspiracy. And there's different reasons. I did a paper on this a few years ago. Why do people tend to go towards conspiracy theories? Because they give you a sense of understanding what's going on, epistemic certainty. Now, it's nonsense, it's an illusion, but it's a very comforting illusion. You think you know what's going on. There's a deep-seated human aversion to randomness. We don't like to, for example, accept that maybe the pandemic was caused by random events out of our control. It is perversely easier for some of us to believe that Bill Gates or George Soros or whoever else made it happen, because suddenly you have a single villain, single actor, and it all makes sense. It's nonsense, but it's comforting for some people. And the last thing is egotism. Conspiracy theorists tend to be, on average, far more narcissistic than the average Joe. And you think about it, that it's really rewarding to their ego to say they could be sitting in the room with, say, the world's greatest immunologist and the world's greatest pediatrician who knows all their facts and has done their homework for years, and they can still think they know more than them about vaccines, right? That's kind of shocking. And there's lots of things that moderate that as well. I'm going to give you a fun example because I always like this. What do these two people have in common? This is Princess Diana, died in 1997 in England, and this is Osama bin Laden, died more recently, right? Anyone know what they have in common? It's not beards. No beards there, no. They're both the subjects of intense conspiracy theories. In the UK, there's people that believe Princess Diana was murdered by the Queen because she was embarrassing the family, or people believe she faked her own death. Same with Osama bin Laden. People believe he was working for the Americans as an actor. Or some people believe he faked his own death. Some people believe he was murdered because he knew too much. What was amazing is a colleague of mine over in the UK studied people, Americans and people from the UK, and they found if they were really into conspiracy theories, they could believe all of these narratives at the same time. Like, because we have Schrodinger's bin Laden, who's both alive and dead at the same time, and that was fine to them. They had no problems with it, provided there was a conspiracy, because that's really what they wanted. They wanted to believe they had knowledge that other people didn't have. And that goes back into the narcissism thing to a great degree. She called the paper Dead and Alive, Beliefs and Contradictory Conspiracy Theories, which I think is a great title for a paper. An actual argument, COVID is a hoax, but it's caused by 5G, and you can cure it with ivermectin. I don't need to tell you that every one of these arguments is mutually exclusive, but people will still make them. And you see it with conspiracy theorists. If you think it's about explaining the world around them, it's a really bad explanation of the world around them. It's not logically consistent, but it's never supposed to be. How much time do we have? Just 10 minutes, Grant. Okay, I can get through loads. I give this one to my students every year. It's an old graph. Cancer rates are going up every year. Back in the 70s, you had a 1 in 3 chance of getting cancer in your lifetime. Now, you lucky sods have 1 in 2 chance of getting it. So what's going on? Anyone want to volunteer a guess? What's happening? More testing? That's actually a really good answer, and it's partly true. But anyone else? Yeah, that we have better screening, so we detect more. Yeah. You're not entirely wrong. I'm gonna spoil it for you. The reason cancer rates are going up is because we have a little bit less of this, right? We have less people dying of cholera, infectious disease, poor sanitation. Turns out that cancer is primarily a disease of aging. On average, you get it when you're older. If you live longer, which we all are living longer, you're rolling the genetic dice more and more and more that you'll eventually get a mutation that becomes cancer. So perversely, the fact that cancer rates are going up actually says that society is getting healthier. But we can be very easily misled by statistics, right? If I put that on TikTok and said, why is the world more carcinogenic? I bet you I could scare you about something. I could pick on one single thing and tell you it's, whatever I wanted. It's 5G, it's bloody, vitamin D. I could make anything up and it would work. And then again, we have the other thing. We're bad at data. So back in World War II, the Americans were fighting with the Japanese over the Pacific Ocean, and they were really upset with the amount of planes they were losing. And what they did is they started taking planes back that had survived dogfights and analyzing where they should reinforce them. So they look at these patterns here, these bullet patterns. See them there? And they go, right. And the first engineer to look at that said, we know what we should do. We should reinforce all the bits that are shot. But there was another statistician called Abraham Wald working there who came to a very different conclusion. And he said, yeah, you know why the planes aren't coming back with like bullet holes in the fuselage and in the engines? Because those ones that get shot don't come back. We're not able to analyze them. And this is called, this is actually a very well-known bias, survivorship bias. For example, if you went to a conference of lottery winners, just people that won the lotto, you'd think, wow, everyone wins the lotto, because you're not seeing the millions of other people that are losing all the time. Data can be presented selectively. Selection bias, and again, I love it from XKCD. Never stop buying lottery tickets, no matter what anyone tells you. I failed again and again, but I never gave up. I took extra jobs and poured the money into tickets. And here I am, proof if you put in the time, it pays off. Every inspirational speech by someone successful should have to start with a disclaimer about survivorship bias. And it's absolutely true. You see, the millionaire CEO who started with nothing. You don't see all the ones that started with nothing and didn't go anywhere. And that's why we be very careful about the information we consume. I love giving this one as well. It's a kind of weird one. The Western ink bottle ELISA test for HIV is a 99.99% accurate. If we want to get really nerdy about it, it's 100% sensitive and 99.99% specific. But we don't need to worry about those definitions for now, right? Now, most of you here look like you're pretty low risk. No one looks like they're a heavy IV drug user. No, you're good. You're good, right? But if you went in tomorrow, I'm going to pick on someone. You go in and the doctor says, I'm very sorry, your test came back positive. What is the probability you have HIV? Anyone want to say? Show of hands for high, like 99.99% accurate test. It comes back. Who thinks that it's high? Few people. Who thinks it's low? Who thinks it's exactly average? No one thinks that, right? I know a lot. And who has no opinion whatsoever? The majority of you, apparently. I'm going to tell you the answer. It's 50%. What? Yeah, I know, exactly. It turns out that bit of information I didn't give you was how common is HIV in low-risk people? And that's why I asked you, what kind of population are you? Well, you're low risk. The answer is about 1 in 10,000 people in a low-risk population will have HIV. Now imagine those 10,000 people go in to get tested, right? All of you get in a big group, you all go in to get tested. One of you has it, and the test will almost certainly flag that person as positive. Will certainly, actually. It's 100% sensitive. But in the remaining 9,999 of you that don't have it, the test isn't perfect. It's going to tell you that one of you has it. Now you've got 2 positive tests in that population, only one of which is a true positive, and 1 in 2 is 50%. If that confuses you, don't worry, that's Bayes' theorem, and it means we have to be so careful with all statistics, because they're always like this. There's always conditional probabilities. Lying with statistics is fun. I do it to my students. I enjoy it. But you're being manipulated by people that do it to you sometimes. And it's very important to ask, if you're given a statistic, what's the context for it and what does that mean? Because we can often make our own inferences and they're wrong, right? And anti-vaccine arguments were the exact same, by the way. During the pandemic, there was a big shocking figure that I was asked to talk to BBC about, that 2/3 of deaths were in the vaccinated population. And this was shocking, and the anti-vaxxers were making great meat out of this, until I had to point out to BBC that 95% of the UK were vaccinated. And if you do it, that number is 5% of the population that weren't vaccinated were responsible for 1/3 of all the deaths. They are not proportional numbers. If you crank the numbers, you show it's between 10 and 20 times more risky to not be vaccinated. But you can take a figure out of context and bamboozle people. What are we doing here? Oh, yes, I'm going to very briefly tell you this before we finish up, because I like this one. Do you remember I told you about AIDS and said that about 12% of the US population believe AIDS was man-made? There's a reason they believe that. And it was a fantastic propaganda campaign that we should always talk about. So when AIDS first was discovered in the early 80s, it was an unknown cluster of diseases in predominantly gay men in San Francisco and New York. And they called it at the time GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency. They then realized very quickly it was affecting immigrants, refugees, drug users. It wasn't just infecting gay men, and they got its modern name, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, again, the USSR and America were at war, and the Soviets had a special propaganda group called Active Measures, and their whole job was to cause consternation in enemy ranks, to spread rumors that made people turn on themselves. And because race is such a loaded thing in America in particular, and because black people were being disproportionately affected, the Soviets went, this is fantastic, we can cause some problems. And also the Reagan administration at the time was very negative towards gay people. So the Soviets went, we see some, divisions in society, let's exploit them. So they came up with a rumor that AIDS was man-made, that it was created by the CIA, and they started running it around America. right? And people got really upset because, again, the Reagan White House wasn't giving enough money to AIDS research. So you could see why people would fall for this. They would see their communities being decimated, and they would go, well, it's very easy to believe that. And the Soviets were patting themselves on the back, having a great time, except for one thing. AIDS was very, very real and spread far and wide. 2 years later, AIDS came to the Soviet Union. Now, the CDC, despite Reagan's lack of support, had already started to develop the first antiretroviral treatments. They had gone above and beyond. Actually, Tony Fauci was very involved in that back then as well. And the USSR under Gorbachev had to suddenly ask help from the Americans, and the one condition help was given was, shut up with that stupid rumor and we'll help you. And they did. But to this day, despite the fact that the Soviet Union apologized for it in 1990, 12% of Americans still believe it. So there's propagandistic reasons to spread rumors like that as well, and it's often to divide things. I'm going to finish up with 1 or 2 slides on how do we avoid this, and then I'm going to let you go, because you've been a very captive, persistent audience here. So if you're countering disinformation, always lead with a fact. If someone says something you know is wrong, start with the fact. Say, look, that is not true. Warn them that there's misinformation, and say whether the information is intentional or unintentional, and then provide a corrective if you can. I'll skip through some of this. I'm going to finish with the last example. If someone tells you there's a secret cure for cancer, this is the way I always say it. You can play devil's advocate, and you can show people why maybe the belief is wrong. So this kind of stuff. The Socratic method is what I always use. Turn it into a discussion. Discussion is way better than a debate, right? If you can say, well, why do you believe that? That's more interesting. So first thing, if you say there's a cure for cancer, I would say to you, which cancer? There's 210 known cancers at least, and they all arise from people and their own cells, and they're all really, really different. So why would there be a single magic bullet? Some respond to chemotherapy, some radiotherapy, some immunotherapy, some not at all. So that's the first thing that should shake their confidence in their argument. The second thing is they go, well, a cure wouldn't be profitable. Big Pharma or the FDA are covering it up. And you point out, actually, if we found that vitamin D cured cancer tomorrow, every pharma company in the world could patent that if they could identify the ingredient and package it to you. It would make them a fortune. It would give them Nobel Prizes. Why wouldn't they do it? We bioprospect all the time. They send people out in the wild in pharma companies to try and find natural ingredients that will cure things. So that happens all the time. That's wrong. And finally, they go, well, the cancer rates are going up because of big pharma. I know most of you don't probably speak ancient Egyptian, but that is a manuscript from 3,000 years ago describing removing a breast cancer by Imhotep, who was an architect and surgeon. He was also the villain in The Mummy with Brendan Fraser. I'm not quite sure why. And this is obviously Hippocrates, the father of medicine, and he famously gave cancer its title because if you let a skin tumor grow for too long, it starts to look like the leg of a crab escaping your face. Cancer of the crab, you ever wonder why? There you go. We don't let that happen anymore. You don't see that very often, but in ancient Greece you did. So not a new disease. You put these all together and you can show it. I'm going to kind of leave it there because I think we probably should discuss things more, but we can discuss other stuff as well.
So we have about 15 minutes, and I'm eager to hear from you. I'm sure you have a few questions for Dave. If you just put up your hand, I will walk over with the mic. Yes.
You were talking about like hidden agendas and propaganda. Do you have a hidden agenda in teaching this to us?
Do you know, that's actually a really good question. And I spend a lot of my time debunking different health myths. And do you know what? It's not very profitable. And I've realized that if I took the skills I had and turned them to the dark side, I could sell health myths much better. So if I had an agenda, and it's a great question, my model is not very profitable, unfortunately, because I'm not selling you anything. I don't have anything. I do have a book, but the publisher gets the money, not me. So that's unfortunate. But that's a really great question to ask. What is someone's agenda? Is someone profiting from telling you the information they're telling you? And it's not always the best test, but it's a good start, because then you can actually ask, well, you point out they have a stake in the game, and that's important. This is a great question.
Thanks. If you guys could just hold off, Jocelyn, with your coats and bags. It's a little bit, I find it disruptive. Just hold off just a couple more seconds. And I'd like another question, though, from the crowd. after our first one. Asma?
Fair enough.
Thanks for that talk. It was really interesting and enlightening. I have a question, actually. Something that I was thinking about while I was listening to you was about how access to information can make it difficult to be able to reason your way through what is real and what's not. And one of the ways that information is not as accessible is through a language barrier. So you mentioned the war in Gaza, and one of the struggles, I think, at least one that I have, is that information that comes from there often is either in Arabic or in Hebrew, and so there are points at which sometimes you stop and you have to rely on translators, or you find links to sources that you can't access. And it was just a thought that I had. It's less of a question and more maybe a question. What do you do with that? What do you do with
That's actually a brilliant point. No, you raise something really important, because what you're talking about is source veracity, which is so important. We also find, by the way, with disinformation, we know that Spanish-speaking communities in America got slightly different flavors of misinformation than English speakers. I grew up in the Middle East, and my Arabic is terrible, but you can see that when you watch, is this being accurately translated? Because, and are we, again, is this being manipulated by one side or another to give us a feel on that? What I would always recommend in that case, and there's no simple answer to that because it's such a complicated question, but what you can do, and I always strive, is look for source verification. So for example, say videos coming out of Gaza, I find that sources like BBC World Service, are particularly good at putting translators in. Now again, my Arabic is still terrible and my Hebrew is even worse, right? But I do have a certain amount of baseline trust that BBC, because they're a regulated journalistic entity that are answerable to the British public and the journalistic regulators, are going to be better at translating that than, say, a random TikTok video I come across or something else. So you do have to put a certain amount of trust in sources, but I always say when something goes viral, I will often then look for the more mainstream media outlets to report it before I accept it. Even if I think I'm outraged, I kind of have to pause my outrage just to check if it's true or not. And that's an idea called information hygiene, where actually we treat all information as a big maybe until we can verify it. And it's really hard to do because, particularly if you're seeing things from Gaza, it's heartbreaking. It's very easy to go, your emotions can get the better of you no matter what you're being shown. It's very hard to say, let's wait and verify, but we'd probably be better off if we did,
Question?
Yes, so you told that information should be verified, but the problem in our society is that basically we'll find proof to any kind of information we'll get, even if it's misinformation. So how can we basically find these proofs, like the ones that we should focus on and not be led by misinformation?
So that's a really good question. And it's actually interesting you're asking it, not you specifically, younger people ask it, because you'll often hear people say, I'm sick of mainstream media or MSM, right? Now, there's a lot of problems with legacy media, and particularly in North America, there's problems with it. But there's one thing that journalistic outlets actually do have. They have regulation, right? They are answerable to press ombudsman, particularly if, say, the BBC is a good example, or any of the Irish regular or European ones. The Fox News model, not so much. So I would often go, look, you are always having to put your faith in some degree, but the way you do that is go, look, is this source a reliable source? For example, something reported in the New York Times, if they make a mistake, they're answerable and actionable to it. If it's from an influencer, they're not responsible for what they say. They could change their story tomorrow. The New York Times is, and its entire reputation is founded on that. So I would say if it comes from the New York Times, probably reliable. From your racist uncle's Facebook page, probably not so much. And but the problem is people treat these sources as equally. There's a hierarchy of evidence base. And what I always say is, for all the problems with legacy media and for how easy it is to just be very cynical and go, I don't trust any of it, do remember that journalistic sources are obligated to give you information as accurately as possible. I will give one caveat to that because it's important. And I was actually, a former student of here in a taxi last night, we were chatting about this, and he said, like, well, what about the Fox News models? Tucker Carlson, who I showed a picture of there, he used to go on Fox News and lie all the time. And he did. But here's what's interesting. His show was an opinion show. And it was framed like it was news, and it wasn't. That's where we have to be subtle. News reporting is very tightly regulated, but the opinions around it and the white noise around it, we have to separate. So the commentators, your Tucker Carlsons or your Joe Rogans, whoever else you like, remember they're commentators. They often come in with their own opinions, but present it like it's news. It's entertaining, but it's not news. And that's important.
Thanks, David. We got one more over here.
It's not exactly a question, but it's more like a statement. Like, a lot of technology is being used to make things look real that are fake. For example, the pictures of Taylor Swift that are surfacing of her in the White House, and also like voices with AI, and sometimes like text messages that people receive. Like, for example, it says, "Hey, it's so and so. My phone is dead." Like, it did. It happened to me once.
Yep.
Well, not exactly me, but to my mom, where she got a message that looked real from
money?
me, but she knew it wasn't me because she knows how I spell. That could play a factor in like what is real and what is fake.
Hugely.
And also sometimes like pieces of voice are taken to make something look real, to make it look like someone's actually in trouble when they're really not.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's information detextualization or fabrication. So deep fakes are a huge problem. But the same solution exists to them, right? And this is, again, I keep going back to the drum of information hygiene. No matter how convincing something looks, there is a moment that we have to take a pause. If something makes us feel strongly or makes us want to react, we have to stop and go, wait, I need to verify this independently. So, for example, when your mother got that message, she was able to go, there was something wrong with it, right? But she also would have verified it independently with you, right? And that's hard to do. Yeah, exactly. And she obviously knows you way too well, which is great. So she was able to go, yeah, that's something wrong. But we have to all start, and it's unfortunately true. And scammers are sometimes a very good acid test of this. A friend of mine is a computer scientist. He rang me with a deep fake of me. So he rang me with my own voice chatting to me for a few minutes. I knew that wasn't me because I happened to be on the other end of the phone. But he was just, but that's why we have to be even more skeptical. And I'm not saying cynical. Cynical is easy to go, I don't believe anything. That's too far. We just have to be, before we accept anything, we have to just go, right, that's very convincing, but I need to check that independently and get back to you. And that pause, if we can just train ourselves to pause and go, before I react, pause, and I'll get back to you. If we let ourselves do that, we'd be in a much healthier situation. And I'm more optimistic seeing young people thinking about that now because, you know, we can fix this. It is fixable. It's just really depressing and annoying, but it's fixable.
David, we have two more questions that I'd like to get in, so we'll start over here.
So my question is, how do we convince someone that they're spreading misinformation when there's personal feelings attached to it? I don't know exactly how to say it, but when it's tied in with that person's personal feelings and emotion on the situation.
That's a great question. So what you're talking about there is an idea called identity protective cognition. And the idea that we actually kind of become our own ideas and we emotionally attach to them. They become part of our identity. If I turn around to you and say, your local sports team sucks, right? You might be personally offended, even though that shouldn't, objectively, that should be like, whatever, dude, I don't care. And that's the same with beliefs. So if someone feels like we're attacking their beliefs, they read that as them being attacked. And that's a psychological human trait, and that's fair enough. I think the way you change minds in that regard is you acknowledge the person's humanity and say, look, I see where you're coming from, but the information I have would suggest this. If it's about trying to get them to change their own mind. I don't think you ever change anyone else's mind. I have it on this slide here. You give people the tools to change their own mind. So often in those situations, you're planting seeds and you go, look, I see where you're coming from, but hear me out. This is what I think. Can you think about that and we'll talk about it another day? And again, that's the pause. You'll often find that when you come back, people have magically shifted their position as long as they've done it themselves. But if you try to browbeat them into it, and this is why I always say debate doesn't really work. Discussions work. Debates make people entrenched in their position. So if you go, I used to do this all the time. Yeah, you're bloody wrong. That's stupid. And then I'd wonder why they were more and more entrenched in their position. Sometimes sowing the seeds and taking the step back is what you do to get it to work.
You said that we should trust like BBC and trusted news outlets. However, if let's say there's a press, for example, in Gaza, they're giving us direct live information, should we trust BBC more than the press? Because sometimes, for example, like you said, the illusory truth, things are repeated over and over again, and people tend to believe that, even if it's proven that it's incorrect. For example, it's called a war rather than a genocide because of how many news outlets have just said the word war over and over again.
I think now. I mean, I'm no political expert here, so I'm caveating this with a certain degree of ignorance. I think the reason news outlets have been reticent to use the term genocide is that they're waiting for the ICJ rulings to come through, and news outlets absolutely a good news outlet has to try to be as impartial as possible, which sounds cold, but BBC the BBC charter is very, very good. I've read it a few times. They have to take this kind of language that often, we would think that's understating it, but they almost have to. They could start referring to a genocide if the ICJ were to come out and be more solid in their ruling, but that could take 4 years. So it might be a retroactively thing where we retroactively call it that. It'll depend on those kind of rulings, because they'll need a standard. Otherwise, they will be accused of taking a partisan stance. Media outlets, impartiality is a very important trend of it. But even Al Jazeera, for example, aren't calling it a genocide, they're calling it a war. But they're saying that acts of genocide may be occurring. The language is, I know it's frustrating, but news outlets have to be that specific and they have to be that careful if they're being good. If they start, and this is where maybe I get a bit suspicious of outlets who jump into very emotive language very quickly. Like the classic example is Fox News down in the US. They will jump into explosive language to try and roll up. I think good journalism requires a long time. And I know it's very frustrating when you're seeing atrocities happening and they're going, why aren't the journalists saying this, why that? They have to go through that rigorous thing to make sure they can't be accused of being biased, which is ridiculous to us watching it. But they have to go at a slower pace. And I know in the modern media world where you can see videos, there was a classic example, ITV, for example, going back to Gaza. They were interviewing a man who was escaping to a so-called safe zone who was shot dead live on camera. And they had to still, even though they had the live footage, they had to go back and they had to get the comment from the IDF in Israel who claimed it didn't happen. And they still pushed it. They still put it out there and said, we recorded this, we stand by what we recorded. But they still had to get the comment and the feedback from the Israeli army who denied it. It's very slow process journalism, but it has to be done rigorously so they can't be accused of anything. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, you're saying that why the frustrations exist with journalists, but if they're doing their job right, they're doing it slowly.
Everyone, I want to thank you for your excellent questions, and I especially want to thank David Robert Grimes. David's going to be joining me. If you're going to be interested in buying his book, Good Thinking, you can get him to sign your copy here in the front. And I welcome you to come again to another event at the Symposium. Have a good day.